We're going to talk about carbs today, but before we do, I wanted to read you some information that comes from something called the Disorder in American Courts. And it says here, these are things people actually said in court, word for word, taken down and now published by the court reporters who had the torment of staying calm while these exchanges were actually taking place. So let me read a few, just in case some of you want to become lawyers in the future, and you want to avoid asking these kinds of questions. So basically the first one is the question comes from the lawyer. So every question comes from the law, the answer comes from the witness thing. But the question is, this myasthenia gravis, does it affect your memory at all? Answer, yes. And in what ways does it affect your memory? I forget. You forget? Can you give us some examples of something you've forgotten? Okay. What's the first thing your husband said when he woke you up in the morning? He said, "Where am I, Kathy? And why did you get up? Why did that upset you?" My name is Susan. Now, doctor, isn't it true that when a person dies in his sleep, he doesn't know about it until the next morning? Think about that. Answer, did you actually pass the bar exam? The youngest son, the 20-year-old, how old is he? Again, this is coming from lawyers. Question, were you present when your picture was taken? Okay. So the date of conception of the baby was August 8th. Yes, was the answer. And what were you doing at the time? Interesting, embarrassing question. She had 3 children, right? Yes. How many were boys? None. Were there any girls? Okay. Question. How was your first marriage terminated? By death. And by whose death was it terminated? Okay. Can you describe the individual? He was about medium height and had a beard. Was this a male or a female? Okay. Last one. Doctor, how many autopsies have you performed on dead people? Answer, all of my autopsies are performed on dead people. Interesting. All right. So maybe some more of those down the road, but today we're going to be looking at carbohydrates. I'm going to go fairly quickly over the first part because I'm assuming that you've had some chemistry and I'm assuming that you understand carbohydrates, but I'll slow down when we get to something I'm not sure that you've heard much about. But let's just real quickly go through the carbs because you hear a lot about carbs these days. Reducing low carb diets and different things like that, but they're an essential nutrient, so we'll talk about them and we should get most of our energy from them, but let's talk about them for a few minutes and, well, for about 45 minutes, and then we'll go from there. Hopefully you've heard monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So monosaccharides would be considered simple sugars, but I also include disaccharides into the simple sugar category. Anything that's sweet, I figure, is in the simple sugar. Now, your book or some other individuals, because they are a disaccharide and they have that covalent bond, may not classify them as a simple sugars, but I do, because they're sweet. And then polysaccharides would have many monosaccharides as part of their structure. Hopefully this is review, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. The main monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose, and then the disaccharides, maltose, lactose, and sucrose. I might, on an exam, expect you to remember the names of the monosaccharides, the names of the disaccharides, and then which monosaccharides make up the disaccharides. So be prepared that I could ask a couple questions on that. But Again, it shouldn't be that hard. Um, Simple sugars, again, sucrose I classify as a simple sugar, even though it's a disaccharide. But sugar cane, honey, milk has lactose. You wouldn't think it was sweet, but it does have a sweetness. There are individuals who actually are milk tasters. They work for the dairy industry, and they can actually, their palate is such that they can actually taste levels of lactose in milk. Where most of us don't even think it's sweet. High fructose corn syrup, you hear a lot about high fructose corn syrup, HFCS, and you'll see it in sodas and a lot of sweet processed foods will have high fructose corn syrup because it's cheap and it's because it has a lot of fructose in it. Fructose is twice as sweet as glucose and sucrose, so you don't have to use as much. But it's manufactured. It's not something that's natural in nature. It is manufactured in the industry. So, but it is inexpensive. But there is some controversy about whether it increases weight gain, it reduces health and that kind of thing. So it is kind of controversial with that, and there's a lot of individuals out there who recommend not taking in high fructose corn syrup. But there are other people who say, well, sugar is sugar is sugar. It doesn't matter where you get the sugar from, honey, sugar cane, high fructose corn syrup, sugar is sugar. So it is debatable. And so anyway, but you probably hear more, and we may discuss it a little bit more in the class as we go along. Health risks of simple sugars. There has been increased evidence of increased visceral fat. Now we'll talk later on more about visceral fat, but visceral fat is the fat that's underneath the muscles of your stomach. So if you see somebody that has a big stomach but it's really hard, it's not like Santa Claus, like jiggly kind of fat, then that is visceral fat, or that's sometimes referred to as central obesity kind of thing. But visceral fat is considered the worst type of obesity or fat that you can have because, like it says here, you can increase insulin resistance and going into type 2 diabetes. And again, later on when we get into diabetes, we'll talk more and more about this. It can increase the risk of heart disease because of the free fatty acids that are broken off from visceral fat before abdominal fat kind of a thing. 35% increase in heart disease for individuals who have a high incidence of visceral fat. Increased liver and muscle fat comes from high sugars. There's some evidence of that. Again, it relates to insulin resistance, which we'll talk about later. Triglycerides elevated, or increased incidence of heart disease. Small dense LDLs, we haven't talked about LDLs yet, but they're considered the bad cholesterol, and they come in different sizes. And the small ones, there's large buoyant ones, and then there's small, and then they decrease in size till you get the small dense ones. And the small dense ones are considered the worst ones to have for increased risk of heart disease and that kind of thing. So there is evidence for reducing the amount of sweets and simple sugar you take in. Obviously, we've heard a lot about dental caries for over many years. Dental caries are cavities. So you know that candy and sweets and that kind of thing can increase the risk of dental cavities. So there is some merit to reducing your simple sugars, especially to the amount that we are eating them in this country. We talked a little bit about them earlier on and how much they've increased in the country, but you can see soft drinks seem to have they've kind of gone down, and bottled water has gone up, so that's kind of a good thing. but and nothing else has really changed that much. I don't know why in 2004 milk went down. I'm not sure what happened there. It's hard to believe that beer is pretty stable, but I mean, this is 2008, but this is the latest data that I could find. But it is a good thing that sodas are going down, but you kind of wonder if diet sodas are going up as the but it says carbonated soft drinks, so I guess I'm not sure if that includes the diet ones or not. But just as long as we're talking about the diet ones, you have to be careful. There's lots of evidence out there that diet sodas can actually cause you to eat more, because when you drink the diet soda and you get the sensation of sweetness, your body prepares to receive the sugar, and you produce insulin and that kind of thing. And then you don't get it, and so your body is saying, "Wait a minute, what's up with this?" And basically increases the what's the word I want? Increases the appetite, or not really hunger kind of thing. It makes you think you want to eat more kind of a thing, because your cells are crying for the sugar because they've been prepared to receive it. So it's not a good idea to drink a lot of diet soda. You may think that you're doing yourself a favor by not getting all those sugar calories, but it's really messing with your body's systems, and it can cause you to actually gain weight because you eat more food, because you start snacking on things a little bit here and there. So be careful with that. Oligosaccharides, now I'm not sure. If you've taken some chemistry, you may have been introduced to oligosaccharides, but oligo means a few, and obviously saccharides are sugars. So oligosaccharides are chains of sugars that anywhere from 3 to 10 monosaccharides long. So we have monosaccharides, a single sugar, disaccharides, 2, obviously trisaccharides would be 3, but anywhere from 3 to 10 is classified under the heading of an oligosaccharide. Some examples are raffinose and stachyose, and I won't expect you to remember the combinations of these. It's not that important. I do with the mono and disaccharides, but these, it's not that critical. And you can see their structure here is different than the polysaccharides and stuff, because you have a mixture of different types of sugars in there: galactose, glucose, fructose here, and then galactose, and so forth on these. So these FOS, fructooligosaccharides, we'll talk a little bit more about those when we get into the probiotic foods and that kind of thing. They enhance the growth of bacteria that would help your system, but we'll talk a little bit more about those, and especially when we get into talking probiotics later on. Oligosaccharides, you get a lot from legumes. Basically anything that causes gas is going to have oligosaccharides. Oligosaccharides are not digestible by our system, and they're not a fiber, so I don't want you to get the idea that they're a fiber. They're very similar to a fiber because they're not digestible, and they will continue down through the small intestines into the large intestines, and when they get to the large intestines, they are, this is a hard word for me to say, fermentable, and so they can be fermented by bacteria, and when the bacteria ferment them, then they're going to produce gas. And so, as you know, legumes increase flatulence. In college, we call it flatulence. You may call it something different, but we call it flatulence. And for some people, eating cabbage and onions and that kind of stuff can also increase gas. But as we'll see later on when we get into probiotics, these foods are good for your digestive system, and they're called prebiotic, meaning that they're going to feed the good bacteria the probiotic bacteria that we'll talk about later. And you've heard about the probiotic bacteria when you Activia commercials and those kinds of things that say take these and eat this and it will help your digestive system with the bacteria. Well, those would be considered prebiotic kind of foods that would encourage and feed these bacteria, make them grow faster. So we'll get into this a little bit more later on down the road when we get into probiotics. But and I just have a little picture down here where it talks about the little friendly bacteria that basically they're able to outcompete. If they get the food they want, they can outcompete the bad unfriendly bacteria here, like the E. coli's and the bacillus and some of those other ones that are considered putrefactory bacteria. Anyway, so oligosaccharides has also been shown to increase calcium absorption and reduce cholesterol. So they are very healthy. So I can't emphasize enough, again, these come from plants. You don't get oligosaccharides from animal foods. So again, the harping and the brainwashing about we need to really increase our plant intake. But plants with oligosaccharides are critical too. You need to get those. They will be very beneficial to your intestinal system. Also important if you want to save some money on gas or some food. So, because kids with gas, so if you feed them oligosaccharides, who knows? You may save some money along the road. You just put them in the back. Yeah, so anyway, just another hint, just to giving you your money's worth here. Polysaccharide, poly means many, so many sugars. So greater than 10, again, oligos would be 3 to 10, and then over 10 would be polysaccharides. I'm going to separate the polysaccharides into two different types. I should also mention that, when we looked at raffinose and stuff, you saw a mixture of galactose and fructose and stuff, but polysaccharides are basically all glucose. There's no fructose, there's no galactose, it's all glucose units. So you might just make a note of that. But I'm going to separate the polysaccharides into storage polysaccharides and structural. Storage polysaccharides would be ones that would be used for energy by either the plant, or when we eat them, we will convert them into energy. And then the structural polysaccharides would be the ones that basically are part of the cell wall of the plant. So in the plant, the storage polysaccharides for plants are starches. So, bread is basically starch, rice, basically starch, that kind of thing. And then glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrate for animals and human beings. And then we'll talk about cellulose, which is a structural polysaccharide, again, as part of the cell wall, and pectins and gums, which are referred to, cellulose is referred to as an insoluble fiber, and pectins and gums as a soluble type of fiber. And so we'll go into a little bit more detail on both of those. But I do need you to separate and know the difference between which is a storage and which is a structural polysaccharide. For that. So starch, comes a lot from potatoes and breads and spaghetti noodles and things like that. And I'm going to emphasize down here, because we'll see a distinction between these and the fibers, because again, none of these polysaccharides have any difference in their monosaccharide. They're all glucose. The difference is going to be in their bonding. And here you can see we have an alpha 1,4 glycosidic linkage, because this is carbon 1 right here, and this is carbon 4. So they refer to this as a 1,4 glycosidic linkage, and it's an alpha linkage. So that's going to be critical. So you might note that this is an alpha 1,4 linkage. And the branches off it, because the starches have branches, are a 1,6, because this is the 6th carbon and the 1st carbon, so a 1,6, or this is the 6th carbon, 1,6 bond here, glycosidic bond. So you're going to find this type of bonding in the starches within bread and potatoes and noodles and rice and those kinds of things. Glycogen is the storage form in humans, and you find it mostly in the muscles and the liver. You can see it's very similar to starch. It does have the alpha 1,4 linkage. It has the alpha 1,6 linkages, but the difference is that glycogen has more branches. My understanding is, and obviously I'm not a chemist, but my understanding is that starch has a branch about 1 every 25 glucose units, whereas glycogen has one about every 12 glucose units. So glycogen is a little bit more compact of a structure, but very similar to starch. And again, you can see that when we eat starches, they will convert those into glucose. They will go into our blood, and then basically the insulin will then be produced that will go tell mainly the muscle and liver cells to take up the glucose. If they're full, because there is a limit, if they get full, then it will go to the fat cells. But you can see that the glucose is going to be converted into glycogen in muscles and the liver. And the glycogen in the liver is going to be used to replace blood sugar when you're sleeping at night and you're not eating or anything, but your heart's still bumping, you're still breathing, so you're using energy, and so you'll start using some of the sugars from your blood. Then to maintain homeostasis, then the glucose from the liver will be, or the glycogen from the liver will be broken down into glucose, and then glucose can be put right back into the blood to keep the blood sugar level at a homeostatic level. Then the glycogen in the muscles is going to be changed into glucose that's going to go through glycolysis and the Krebs cycle and all of that for respiration to produce ATP. So it's mainly going to be used within the muscle. So the liver glycogen converts the glucose into usable glucose that can be put into the blood and replaces the blood, whereas the one in the muscles can be used to make ATP. This just shows the difference in the branch. You can see this is a little bit more highly branched and compact, and amylopectin is a type of starch, and so you can see it's got a little bit more spacing in there, so glycogen's a little bit tighter. And so this is what long distance runners would use when they do carbohydrate loading. Is basically glycogen loading, because what they're trying to do is increase the amount of glycogen that they have available to make ATP. If you get into a little bit more chemistry, what you'll find out is that one of the mantras is that glycogen is the kindling that keeps fat burning going. Because you can't burn, when you run out of glycogen, you can't burn fat because there's some activity going on in the Krebs cycle and stuff that you need that the glucose, and so you can hit the wall kind of thing. So that's where the whole basis of the carbohydrate loading comes in. But it's basically trying to increase your glycogen loads in your muscles and your liver, so you have that excess to go to do the marathon or whatever you're going to do, kind of a thing. Cellulose. Now, cellulose is not digestible by human beings. And you can see it's considered an insoluble fiber. You find a lot in cotton, grass, things that are very strong. Some of you ladies that take off your makeup with the cotton balls, that's basically all insoluble cellulose. And you know how strong that is and that kind of thing. It's not digestible by humans, and it's not soluble in water, which basically is the designation that it's insoluble. But it's going to be very important for health, and so we'll talk about a little bit later about that. But you find this, again, in the cell walls of plants. So you don't find cellulose in animals or human beings because we don't have cell walls. Kind of a thing. And so in this picture just reflects that. So here's the cellulose fibers coming out and becoming fiber, but you notice that they are just chains of glucose. It's the same exact thing as a starch as far as the monosaccharides. There's no difference between the monosaccharides of a fiber and the monosaccharides of starch. And we'll talk of that in just a second, but here you can see I've just got a representation of a plant cell wall, and you can see where cellulose, the yellow parts, is kind of just a matrix there that is going to give strength to the cell wall and that kind of thing. And sometimes it's referred to as being part of the secondary cell wall. There's a primary cell wall, which is the one on the outside, and then there's a secondary cell wall that is made up basically of 100% cellulose. So it gives strength to the cell wall, and what helps makes things crisp when we bite into them. But here I wanted you to notice the difference. Before we had talked about starch, and we said that it had the 1,4 alpha 1,4 linkage and alpha 1,6. What you'll notice is that in the cellulose, it has a beta 1,4 linkage. So you can see the difference. This one looks like a V, but this one is just straight. So it's a beta linkage, and it's different three-dimensionally. So we can't just, I don't have a picture of 3 dimensions, but it is going to change the angles and everything. But the only reason we can't digest cellulose is because we do not have the enzymes to break a beta linkage. It's as simple as that, because you notice, again, this glucose and this glucose, well, this glucose and this glucose here are exactly the same. There's no difference in the monomers or the monosaccharides within starch and cellulose. The only difference is the linkage here, beta versus alpha. That's the only difference. This is not digestible. This is digestible. Okay. So if we ate grass, we would die, because we would not be able to break this bond and get the glucose into a monosaccharide again, so we could absorb it and we could go through cellular respiration to produce ATP. So we would basically die. But you know, there are animals that all they basically eat is grass and hay and things like that. And so you might be wondering, well, why do cowies and sheepies and goats and things, how come they can live off grass and leaves and things and we can't? So your first thought might be, well, obviously they have the enzymes to break down the beta linkage. Well, you would be wrong, because if you look at ruminant digestion, you'll notice this is munching grass, and the grass is swallowed, and goes into this stomach here called the rumen, and then goes to the reticulum here, and then it goes, the red part goes back and they start chewing their cud, and then it goes back in here. So ruminants have 4 stomachs, and these first 2 stomachs basically have bacteria that will break down the fibers and separate the solid from the liquid. So you separate the solid from the liquid, and then you have the solid cud. But you will break down the fibers and soften them stuff, and then they will chew, and then they'll go back to these regular stomachs, which is kind of like ours. So they don't have the enzymes, but they do have the bacteria, the ability of having bacteria that will allow them to break that down. So see how much you're learning, not only about humans, but about cowies and stuff. Anyway, pectin and gums. Now this isn't gum like you'd eat, but it's gums that you may or may not have heard about, that are important for thickness, and they're thickeners, and we'll talk about some of those. But the pectin gums are referred to as soluble. So cellulose is insoluble fiber, and pectins and gums are soluble fiber. Not so much that they dissolve in water like sugar or salt, but more that they can absorb water and form a gel, and they get gelatin-like and almost like sticky, like gel or something, not like gummy kind of thing, sticky kind of thing. Like, well, if you think about cooking oatmeal, when you get done cooking oatmeal is sticky. I mean, it'll stick to things. So it has a lot of soluble fiber in oats. And then fruit, the pectins, how come you can shine an apple? Because it has pectins in it. Pectins and gums are part of the cell wall, but they're usually the primary, so they're kind of more on the outside of the cell wall. But they're both, kind of allow the cells to stick together and that kind of thing. And they are fermentable by bacteria. So they form a gelatin and are fermentable, and they're used a lot in the food industry for thickeners. Like if you take a low-fat ice cream or something like that, if you take all the fat out, you don't get the mouthfeel, the thickness, and mouthfeel is an important thing. I think we talked about it earlier, the organoleptic kind of an issue, is that we like the mouthfeel, we like the thickness of things, so low-fat salad dressings and low-fat ice creams and mayonnaise or something like that will have gums put into them, xanthan gum, locust bean gum, carrageenan, those types of things that basically absorb water, become thicker, so they absorb the free water, and therefore it makes things thicker because you don't have the extra free water in them. Anyway, you can see here's pectin. This green thing is it's part of the cell wall of a plant. So anyway, I need you to know which ones are insoluble, which ones are soluble, and we'll get into the health aspects here in a minute. But as far as the recommendations for carbohydrates, 250 to 300 grams a day, which represents pretty close to 58 to 60%, if you're in terms of if you take 300 calories or 300 grams times 4 calories, that'd be about 1,200 calories. And so if we say an average intake is 2,000 calories, 1,200 calories is pretty close to 58, 55, 60%. So that's the recommendation here. As far as sugar, I really don't expect you to remember these numbers, but I do want you to know that there is a recommendation for how much sugar an individual should have per day. And then these are numbers I want you, so don't worry about the sugar numbers, but do worry about, if you will, the dietary fiber. I do want you to know that the recommendation is, there's two recommendations. If you're looking at calorie intake, the recommendation is to get 14 grams for every 1,000 calories. So therefore, if you ate a 2,000 calorie diet, you'd want to get about 28 grams. If you're just doing a blanket recommendation of how much you should get per day, the American Dietetic Association recommends 25 to 35 grams per day. So they don't really look at how many calories you're eating. They're looking at how much do you actually need per day, no matter what you're eating. It doesn't matter if you're eating 1,000 calories or 2,000 calories, you need to get 25 to 35 grams per day for intestinal health, basically, that kind of a thing. And the recommendation is a 3-to-1 ratio of insoluble to soluble. That is if you don't have any underlying physical problems. If you have an intestinal issue, then the 3-to-1 ratio may not, be the recommendation for you. So if you have no intestinal problem, completely, as far as you know, healthy, then a 3-to-1 ratio is what you'd be striving for. So more insoluble than soluble. And you will be addressing this in your diet study to see if you fit that 3-to-1 ratio recommendation. So I will want you to remember that, because if I give you a question on an exam that says how many grams of fiber would you need if you were on a 2,500 calorie diet, I would expect you to be able to figure out knowing 14 per thousand. But if I said what is the recommendation of the American Dietetic Association of how much fiber you should be getting, then you would go for the 25 to 35 grams per day. Okay. Now, what's the importance of fiber in our health? So what this is, this table is showing you is this column deals with soluble, this column deals with insoluble, and then I've just listed, you know, here the gums and pectins would come under the water insoluble, the cellulose under insoluble. We're not going to talk too much about lignans. You will find a lot of lignans in broccoli, so they are important, but you know, there's just only so much we can talk about in the class. So you can look up lignans if you want to. I mean, they are important, but it's not something we normally spend a lot of time in. But what I do want you to know is that the food sources. So I will expect you to know what food sources are high in water soluble and water insoluble. And actually on your diet study, before I forget to say, on your diet study, we would expect you, when you're looking at your diet, we're going to make the assumption that vegetables are basically water insoluble, fruits, oats, and so forth are basically water soluble. So what you're going to be doing, going through your 3-day intake and going through those spreadsheets, you would basically say, you know, any fruit that you eat or any legume, you're just going to say that that is all water soluble. We know it's not, but for the paper's sake, we're going to. And then anything that's a vegetable or like wheat bread, whole wheat bread, or anything like that, it's going to be all the fiber will be insoluble. So we're going to ask you to see where you fit into that 3-to-1 ratio, or basically 75% insoluble, 25% soluble. So we, you know, more vegetables and wheat than fruits and oats and legumes, kind of a thing. As far as fiber is concerned, now legumes, they have the oligosaccharides, and that, which are important, but we're just looking specifically at the fiber. Now, what's the importance of water soluble? The glycemic effect, we'll talk about the glycemic index later on when we get into diabetes and things like that, but it basically slows down the absorption of food because it's going to gel up and draw water, so it's going to kind of slow everything, make everything thicker, so it can make you feel fuller. So it may be sometime when you've eaten beans or oats or something like that, and you know you ate too many of them, and because they're going to expand in your stomach. But that is, if you're looking for weight control, these would be good, like eating oats or legumes would be good because they'll make you fuller. They'll make you feel fuller because they will expand. There is, I mean, very similar to remember we said the oligosaccharides will bind to dietary cholesterol, but remember, the oligosaccharides are not a fiber. So please remember, I could ask you which of the following are not fibers and put oligosaccharides in there, and you would not choose, I mean, you would choose that as not being a fiber. But again, water soluble, they can bind onto cholesterol and not allow it to be absorbed. So it's basically taken out in your waste. So if eating cholesterol is your problem, which it isn't for everyone, because everybody's different, that could help reduce blood cholesterol and that kind of thing. And then it can help in reducing heart disease. On the water insoluble, we can reduce diverticulosis, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. What that means, kind of an outpouching of your intestinal system. Water insoluble fibers are going to increase bulk in your waist, which basically is going to stimulate the anal sphincters and cause you to become regular. So the insoluble fibers are good to keep you regular, and so they can reduce constipation and increase stool elimination. They are also, because we'll talk again more about this when we get into the cancer section, but the longer your waist stay in the colorectal area, the higher the risk of colorectal cancer because of all the organic acids and things that are produced while the bacteria are fermenting your food. So the goal is to get rid of that waste as fast as possible so that it's not really the good bacteria, it's the bad bacteria that are going to produce these organic acids that can increase the risk of colorectal cancer. So by eating more insoluble fibers, you basically get rid of those waste as fast as possible, and you don't give the bacteria enough time in order to make those things, and you reduce the risk of that. Diverticulosis, here you can see is, this little outpouching here of the intestinal tract, and it can get, food can get caught up in there, and it can basically putrefy and can get rotten, and it can cause some infection down there, and so you'd have to have it surgically fixed, kind of a thing. So as from the chart, you can see that insoluble fibers, before you get diverticula, or the disease is called diverticulosis, you would want to increase your insoluble fiber basically to just keep you cleaned out, and so you don't form the diverticula. If you have diverticula, then they're going to change your diet because the insoluble fiber is going to be a little bit rough. I mean, your grandma or great-grandma probably used to call it roughage, kind of a thing. And so it could irritate the bowel. So you might go on a softer diet for a while until you get that taken care of, and then go back on a higher and higher insoluble fiber so you can keep cleaning it out. But the goal of eating insoluble fibers to keep cleaned out so you don't get diverticula, that kind of a thing. This is just kind of an illustration of the soluble fiber and cholesterol. So anyway, the idea is, if you can see here, the cholesterol is the C, the soluble fiber is the O, and so if you eat those together, kind of thing, then you can see that it kind of binds to the cholesterol and takes it out. Because the two things we'll talk about when we get into digestion. I mean, you can get cholesterol from your food, but bile, which helps in emulsifying the foods, and especially lipids, also has a component of cholesterol. So if you can not only absorb the cholesterol from the food that you eat, but you can also reabsorb the cholesterol that came from the liver and the bile. So what can happen with the soluble fiber is they can capture that cholesterol that comes from your food and the liver and take it out, so you eliminate it in your waste, and it doesn't get reabsorbed back into your body. So for some people that helps, and so if you are diagnosed with having a risk for heart disease or high cholesterol, basically one of the recommendations they would probably give you is to eat more soluble fiber. And so the 3-to-1 ratio would not work for you because you have a condition that would lend itself to more soluble fiber. Okay. Colon cancer, again, colon cancer is just when you get a little polyp here, and usually you get a colonoscopy. They can kind of cut these out, which is why, at age 50 you should get a colonoscopy. It's really not that bad. The worst part, as you may know, is preparation for it, where they give the medications to basically ream you out. That's the worst part. The colonoscopy, I mean, they put you to sleep and you wake up and it's done. And then hopefully they say, we didn't find anything, you're on the 10-year plan. I think I had my first one when I was, what was I? I was 55. Yeah, 55, I think. And they did find a polyp and they cut it out, so I was on the 3-year plan. So I went back and had another one in 3 years and didn't find anything, so I'm now on the 10-year plan. So anyway, but it's really not that bad. It's work. I'd rather do that than have the problem of colon cancer. But insoluble fiber can help, again, because the acids and byproducts that are produced by fermentation of some bacteria, for whatever reason, can be an initiator of colon polyps and that kind of thing. All right. There is such a thing as getting too much fiber, and what you're seeing here is called a fiber ball, more known as a phytobasor. So phyto always refers to plants, and basor is a ball kind of a thing, so a plant ball. But it's just ball of fiber that has built up in the intestines and basically causes a blockage. So it has to be surgically removed. And anytime you get greater than 60 grams of fiber a day, you run the risk of getting a phytobasor. It'd be very difficult to get over 60 grams a day if without supplementation. You'll find that, when you do your diet study, most of you, don't be surprised if, the recommendation is 2,000 calories would be 28 grams or 25 to 35 grams. Don't be surprised if you're in the 14 range, 14, 15 gram range, getting about half of what you actually need. Because but if you're eating a lot of plants, then you're going to get a lot of fiber. But some of you that are going to have the recommended amount, say you get 30 grams of fiber, you're going to look at your diet and you're going to notice that you have been eating a lot of plants. Now, how could you eat twice as much as you're eating of those plants? It would be pretty hard. You'd really have to try. So usually people that get in problems with phytobasors is they're taking a supplement of something, and they're getting too much fiber. So you have to be careful. Just with everything, we go back to our first lecture on moderation. I mean, when people get into trouble, they go crazy. They megadose on stuff, and it causes them problems. There is such a thing as getting too much of a good thing, right? So don't go crazy. Follow the recommendations. You know what to do, but just don't go overboard. Because you can get yourself into trouble. So, and there is also a recommendation for not swallowing your gum. Believe it or not, there is a health recommendation, because if you swallow your gum, this could be a possible outcome. So please, you should spit your gum out, but don't put it underneath your desk, and don't put it underneath the seat. You can put it in the garbage can or something. But anyway, all right. So this is our carbohydrate section. I hope we taught you something, and next time we'll look a little bit at lipids, I believe. So thanks for spending time with me, and we'll talk to you next time.